Night lay across Coruscant like a sheet of imperfect glass, reflecting fire. Smoke braided the wind between towers, and the temple's alabaster flanks drank in the glow of burning speeders and the hard blue of weapons fire. Sirens throbbed deep in the durasteel bones of the city planet, a low oceanic pulse beneath the crackle of distant explosions. From the north terrace of the Jedi Temple, white-armored soldiers marched with a practiced inevitability that looked, from above, like a diagram of surrender. Anakin Skywalker stood in the doorway beneath the high lintel engraved with 1,000 years of names. The stones smelled faintly of rain and ash. He could feel the building itself, the old heartwood of the Order, trembling under the weight of choices he had already made. He did not look behind him at the ranks of the 501st. He listened instead to the building, and to his own heartbeat, and to the memory of a voice that had once said with strange warmth, "I will watch over you, little one." He had not slept since the Chancellor's office, since the purple flash and the scream and the sudden, unbearable quiet after Mace Windu fell into the storm. His fingers remembered the heat of blue lightning crawling up his arms. His lungs remembered the clean, cold relief when when the Chancellor had named him, had given him a title that sounded like a door closing. Darth Vader. The syllables were heavy as shackles and cool as water. "General." Commander Appo's voice was filtered flat by his bucket. "Your orders." Anakin's lightsaber sat cold against his palm. He had not ignited it yet. In his mind he saw Padme's face, lit by the emergency beacons that laced the Senate district, her eyes wide with smoke and questions. He saw her hand lift toward him the last time, her fingers steady when she touched his cheek, the way she always touched him, as if he were a calm place rather than a blade. "Secure the hangars and the archives," he said. His voice carried easily in the cavernous hall, swallowed by vaulted arches, and returned to him in hollow echoes. "No survivors leave the temple." "Yes, sir." They advanced. The main hall was long and luminous and wrong, the way a childhood room becomes wrong when its furniture is moved. The statues of ancient masters watched with blind patience as blue bolts leapt from clone rifles and red and green blades answered them. The first resistance came in a ripple. 2 temple guards at the far end of the corridor, yellow sabers crossing bright as born lightning. They moved with rigid precision, the formal language of Ataru and Sorisu written in their bodies, and the clones fell in hard, clattering heaps around them. Anakin met them without words. He did not think about the faces beneath their masks. He did not think about names. Names reached for him and he stepped aside. He was efficient because he had to be. The temple's air was noise and heat and the clean metallic scent of freshly cut durasteel. He moved through it like gravity moves through space. Invisible, unarguable, leaving remainders of bent trajectories and silence. On a mezzanine above the room of 1,000 fountains, blaster fire shredded mist into glittering curtains. A young knight with the scarlet braids of a Lordian dove from a balcony and met him midair. For a moment the two of them hung above falling water, blades spinning at the axis of their gaze. She smelled of ozone and fear, and under the fear something stubborn and earnest that made his chest ache with rage. "You don't have to do this," she said between impacts. Her saber was the hot green of spring vines. "I already have," he said, and ended it. He told himself, as he cut and deflected and pressed, that this was the only way to save Padme. Every life he took was a rung in a ladder up from the vision of her dying. A ladder slick with blood, yes, but steady but real. The Chancellor had promised knowledge the Jedi had refused to share. He could feel the edges of that knowledge already, like cold glass in his pocket. Smoke saturated the training halls. The scent of scorched plastoid and charred robes crawled across the floor. Clones were dragging the bodies of Padawans to clear fields of fire, while a squad pushed toward the council spire. Appo kept step with him, methodical as a metronome, and never once looked up to meet Anakin's eyes. "The council chamber," Anakin said. They climbed the spiral ramp. Holocron alcoves winked in the walls like old stars. Far below, turbolifts screamed and died. Far above, the beacon tower sent its lying call across the hyperspace lanes, instructing all Jedi to return home. He would go there soon and fix that message, so it was not a lie, so it delivered exactly the trap it pretended to be. He did not yet know whether it was mercy to change it or cruelty to leave it, only that Sidious had given him a task, and if he did the task completely, Padme would live. The council chamber doors parted like a mouth. The circular room was tall and empty of furniture except for the 12 chairs with their quiet authority. There were children inside, small in their shadowed robes, gathered in a knot near the window where the city bled red and blue into darkness. A human boy lifted his chin when Anakin entered, as if in answer to a cue. He had a mop of dark hair and the stubborn set of someone who had worked very hard at something small forms, perhaps, or patience. "Master Skywalker," the boy said, voice thin with fear and relief. "There are too many of them. What are we going to?" Anakin's saber answered him with a harsh breath as its emitter flared to life, the blue blade bright enough to paint the children like ghosts. The clones behind Anakin lifted their rifles as one. Anakin raised his free hand, and the rifles eased down again around a ring of confusion. "I will take care of this," he said to the clones, his tone flat, command beaten into steel. "Secure the perimeter. No one enters." A pause. "Sir," Apo said, "you have your orders." The door whispered shut behind them. Silence swelled, anchored by the hum of his blade and the soft animal breath of frightened children. The boy at the front stared at the saber and then at Anakin's face and back again, trying to reconcile the two. Anakin remembered another soft-breathed room, another night full of fire, another handful of children washed ashore by war, a small blond boy in a dusty tunic with a slave's chip burning under his skin, a tall, smiling Jedi with a warm voice. "Trust me," he had said, and Anakin had. He thumbed his blade off. The sudden quiet thumped in his ears. "Listen to me," he said. He did not recognize his own voice. "All of you, you do exactly what I tell you. You do not argue, you do not ask questions. If you disobey, you die. If you obey, you might live." For a heartbeat, absolute stillness, as if the room itself held its breath. A little Twi'lek girl bit her lip. A Nautolan boy edged closer to a Wookiee whose paws shook with held-in sound. A Lothian girl at the back, older than the rest, with the long scalp beads of her people, lifted her chin the way the human boy had, as if to take the weight off the smaller ones by example. "Master," she said. "Do not call me that," Anakin said too sharply. He looked at their faces until his eyes ached. "There is a maintenance access behind the dais. It's older than the Republic. It leads into the underways, and from there to the cistern caverns. There are sensors, but I can blind them for a while." "Why would you help us?" the human boy blurted. "Because I can't kill you," Anakin did not say. "Because I see my son's eyes among you, though my son hasn't yet opened his. Because if I destroy you too, there will be nothing left of me but a weapon. Because the clones will not show you mercy," Anakin said instead, each word a taxed breath. He crossed to the dais, fingers tracing a seam in stone he had studied as a Padawan as a curiosity. He had traced it again as a night out of nostalgia. He pressed his thumb against the old Jedi sigil hidden under the lip, the panel side inward, old gears complaining. Cold air breathed from within, damp and faintly green, the smell of the temple's own slow breath. He extended his senses through the floor, down into the narrow arteries of the building, and found the bones of the temple. Conduits like nerves, stone like old muscle, little scurrying presences like birds. He tasted the acidic glare of security eyes and reached for them. With a twist of the Force, he turned them away. For a few hours, they would see nothing but empty air and a wash of static. "You will follow this passage until you find iron stairs going down," he said. "You will keep going down until you hear water. There is a hidden door in the southeast wall of the cistern hall with a service sigil shaped like a broken circle. It opens to a cavern with black stone and roots like petrified smoke. You will wait there, in the dark, until you hear 3 raps on the door in this pattern." He tapped a rhythm on the side of the dais. 2 quick, 1 long, 1 quick. "If you do not hear it by dawn, you will find your way out into the underlevels and keep your hoods up and your mouths closed. Do not ignite a saber. Do not try to reach anyone. Do not use your names. You will breathe and be small and be nothing until you find someone you can trust. Do you understand? The human boy swallowed hard. Who can we trust? The answer was I don't know. The answer was the only person he knew he trusted was someone he had just betrayed. Bail Organa, Anakin said after a breath, because he had seen the senator's open face on too many committee platforms not to think of him, because the man had a way of looking at the world as if it were salvageable. If you see him, you run to him. No one else. The choice knifed something inside him. Bail Organa would set himself against the Emperor, and therefore against Anakin. He would also save children if he could. It would have to be enough. And you, Sky, the though Lothian girl caught herself. What will you do? What I must. He did not add for her. He did not add for all of you. In the passage there is a junction after 20 meters. A service droid will meet you. It answers to the designation T8. It will be afraid. Tell it the temple remembers. He took the chain from around his neck. The tiny metal charm at its end was a clipped fragment of a podrace flag, a talisman he had kept since Tatooine out of stubbornness rather than belief. It smelled faintly of oil and sand. He pressed it into the human boy's palm, closing the child's fingers around it. When the door opens, he said, you count to 500 before you move. You do not look back. If you hear anything behind you, you forget it. You understand me? I understand, the boy said. His voice cracked. Anakin's throat hurt. He nodded. He eased the little ones toward the opening with a gesture. The Wookiee ducked and scrabbled, his breath a saw. The Nautolan boy held the Twi'lek girl's hand. The though Lothian lingered, the beads at her temples chiming faintly as she bowed in a gesture too formal for her age. May the Force be with you, she said. The words brushed his skin like the whisk of a soft blade. He almost said, and with you. What he said, too softly to be heard by anyone else, was forgive me. When the last child vanished into the wall, he sealed it. He reached farther into the security grid, found the eyes behind the eyes. The central recorder that would, in a quarter hour, present the Chancellor with its precise, implacable narrative, and turned its gaze away from this room, from these minutes. He was not sure whether he had saved their lives or only delayed their deaths. He was not sure whether saving them made him a traitor to the promise he had made on the office balcony, lightning scarring his memory. He was not sure of anything except that he could not raise his blade against the children and still be the person Padme would reach for when she labored. He stood for a moment in the empty council chamber and let the quiet press against him like a bandage. Then he turned and reopened the doors. Report, he said to Appo. Council Tower is secure, Appo said. Resistance in the archives. A saber instructor and 2 Padawans holding the eastern stack. Multiple troopers down. Sandralig, Anakin said, almost to himself. He had trained beneath that man's patient gaze until the names of forms were a second language. I'll handle him. He walked through smoke and the chemical sting of extinguishers toward the archives. The grand hall loomed bone-white, ribs arching overhead, holoredouts stuttering and flicking through the hot air. The great bas-relief of the Order's history was half-lit by fires, a fractured poem in stone. Dralig met him at the threshold with his guard's armor soot-streaked and his blade steady. Skywalker, Dralig said with weary sadness. And then there was no room for words. Their duel wrote light into the archive gloom. Spiral on spiral, green and blue knitting and splitting like waves that knew only one shore. Dralig's stance was all economy. The minimum cut through space to accomplish the purpose. The short adjustments of a man who had corrected 1,000 beginners and found in correction a quiet faith. Anakin's was speed and pressure and the remorseless calculus of someone who refused endurance to others because he had never been allowed it himself. They were perfectly matched for 6 exchanges, 7, 8. On the 9th, Anakin saw the tiny stutter at the corner of Dralig's mouth when smoke bit his lungs and pressed. On the 10th, he changed angle without warning and took the instructor through the thigh. Dralig fell with a hiss of breath. He still tried to raise his blade. Anakin knocked it aside and ended it because kindness is sometimes only swiftness. He altered the temple beacon before the hour turned. He stood in the tower room with its clear view of the crawling lights of the city and coded his voice into the message that went spinning along the hypercom like a web. All surviving Jedi, return to the temple at once. The council orders it. He loathed the sound of his voice. He pictured them coming. Tired knights limping from battlefields, scarred masters with hope as stubborn as weeds. Some of them his friends, many of them strangers, and for each one, he felt his stomach knot and his palms go cold. He told himself it would be easier that way. He told himself it would end faster. Sidious called him before dawn. The Chancellor's voice on the secure channel was rough as old clay and warm with satisfaction. I trust the temple is quiet, he said. It will be, Anakin said. Then you are ready for your next task. The Separatist Council has gathered on Mustafar. You will go there and bring an end to this war. Anakin closed his eyes for a heartbeat and saw Padme on her balcony with the wind tangling her hair, the glow lines of Coruscant moving like schools of fish. He saw little hands vanishing into stone. Yes, my master. He did not visit Padme before he left. He did not trust his face or hers. He did not trust what mercy might make of his resolve. Below the temple, in a cradle of black stone, 14 children huddled in a tight clot of breath and whispers. The air in the cistern chamber smelled of wet copper and old roots. The noise from above came down as a distant heartbeat, irregular and frightening because it was too big to belong to a body. The human boy with the podrace flag charm around his neck counted in a steady murmur that made the other's shoulders unknot. The Wookiee, whose name was Gungi, held the Nautolan boy's hand and swallowed his soft keening with the discipline of a student who had once been proud of his self-control. The Lothian girl counted with the human boy for a time and then, when she was sure his breathing had settled into a rhythm, stopped and listened to the walls, as if they spoke a language she nearly remembered. She had a memory of Ahsoka Tano laughing as the children sparred with training sabers in a room that smelled of wood and sweat and triumph. She had a memory of her own Kyber crystal singing to her on Ilum, its voice a thin thread through cold darkness. She did not have a memory of the temple full of smoke or of the sound of so many boots. T8 found them before 500. The maintenance droid's dome protruded from a service slit like an anxious turtle. It whistled loudly and then subsided to a near-silent trill. The Lothian girl crouched and touched its dented chassis. "Do you remember?" she said. "The temple remembers." T8's indicator flickered. This was a phrase the old master of facilities had used when he asked for patience from the old walls, half joke, half liturgy. The droid chirped the all-clear and led them deeper, lights dim to preserve them. On the steps of the Jedi Temple, later that morning, a senator in a midnight blue speeder kept his face composed as a child. Tall for his age, with a sable braid at his temple, stumbled into the open and was cut down by a volley of blaster fire before Bail Organa could take a breath. The boy fell like a puppet with its strings cut. His saber skittered across the polished stone and went over the edge into empty air. The clones drew their bead on the senator's chest and then lowered their rifles as if someone had whispered please. Bail's hands shook on the yoke. He reversed and left because to stay would be to die uselessly, and because he had the sudden, bone-deep certainty that he would be needed later. He was needed sooner. When he pulled into a narrowing lane along the temple's east foundation to catch his breath, a side panel in the stone scraped open and a cluster of small forms tumbled into shadow. They froze when they saw the speeder's glow. They did not ignite sabers. They did not cry out. They crouched like alley cats, ready to vanish into holes too small for pursuit. Bail saw them and did not call to them. He did not because he could read fear the way he could read Senate votes, in posture, in the angle of a head. He set his speeder to idle and slid down from the cockpit, letting his empty hands hang where they could be seen. The Lothian girl's chin lifted. She looked at the human boy. They had no words. Words were flags in a wind that would get them killed. Bail knelt slowly to bring his face level with theirs. "My name is Bail Organa," he said. A simple sentence that changed shape as it left his mouth. He heard the audacity of saying a name aloud in a day when names were being ground into numbers. "I have a ship a few blocks from here with medical supplies. I can hide you." The human boy's fingers went to the charm at his throat. He swallowed, and when he spoke, the courage poured out like brittle glass. Master Skywalker told us. He stopped. The girl closed a hand on his sleeve. The senator's eyes flicked, and in them something flared and went inward. He had heard the temple's smoke-thick rumor already. Anakin Skywalker leading troops into the halls where he had been raised. He had not let himself believe it. He did not know whether this boy's half-sentence was lie or trap or miracle. "Get in," he said softly. "Please." They moved in a sudden lurch as if the decision, once it had weight, had to be carried quickly before arms gave out. They tumbled into the rear compartment. Bail touched the throttle and rose smooth as a sigh into the thick traffic stream. His face the unstartled face of a man late to a meeting. Yoda set foot on a Republic gunship with Kashyyyk sunlight in his eyes and watched the war change shape around him. The clones who had been his soldiers lifted rifle. Yes, and turned their muzzles toward his green heart. He felt the shape of it before it happened, like a great beast rolling under the sea. He moved without thinking. 2 troopers fell headless to either side. He looked up toward nothing, toward the old high places where he had once spoken with the living and the dead, and felt a brush of presence like the flutter of a moth's wing. "More to learn I have," the small voice inside him said. "Yet more to lose." By the time Yoda and Obi-Wan reached Coruscant, the smoke over the temple had thinned and the smell of it had sunk into the stone. They cut through squads of clones with tired efficiency and an absence of ceremony, like undertakers. The temple doors resisted them as if they had opinions. The halls whispered names that hurt to hear. They found the beacon and changed it to a warning. They found the archives and bowed their heads over Sian Dralig's body. They found no living Jedi. They did not find the children in the Blackstone Cavern because T8 had led them already away. The droid, beeping fast at the seams from stress, had arranged for a rust-streaked service barge at the edge of the temple's cooling towers. The barge's pilot, an asthmatic Duros who liked droids and disliked authority in any flavor, ferried 14 hooded figures south along a drainage channel that smelled like the inside of a drowned bell. He delivered them 2 blocks from a private platform where a senator speeder was just settling to its rails. Bail loaded them into the hold of the Tantive's smaller shuttle with the efficiency of a man who knew that speed was tenderness. His captain took one look at the passengers, one look at the senator, and began a checklist with no mention of names. They lifted, slid into a commercial lane that hid them among cargoes of grain and ore, and vanished into traffic like a small fish into a school. Obi-Wan stood in the council chamber and felt the afterimage of choices vibrating in the air, faint as the echo of a bell. There was a seam in the dais he did not remember. He knelt and pressed the stone with his fingers. The panel opened an inch and stopped, locked from the other side by a code that was not his. He looked at Yoda. Yoda said, eyes half-lidded, listening to a sea only he could hear. "Small feet the floor remembers. Not all lost, perhaps." Obi-Wan breathed as if he had been underwater too long. He turned his face toward the window and the flow of Coruscant beyond, and somewhere beyond that great phosphorescent ocean, Mustafar burned like a coal. "He is there," he said softly. "Go you must," Yoda said. "Master," Obi-Wan said, and his voice was a thread. "If there are younglings, the children." Yoda's gaze sharpened. He nodded once, a slow, precise gesture. "Found some, Bail Organa has. Others, feel them, I do not. But spared, perhaps." His ears flicked as if catching a whisper. A choice made where none expected. Obi-Wan swallowed. The news lodged in him like a thorn and a salve. If Anakin had spared children in this slaughter, then the man Obi-Wan loved like a brother was not completely gone. If Anakin had spared them and still done all the rest, then perhaps the last thing Obi-Wan could offer him was the mercy of honesty. He found Padme before he left. She stood in the entry of her apartment with a small overnight bag in her hand, the kind of bag one takes when one has decided to carry nothing that cannot be carried on the body. Her face was a study in poise accelerated by fear. He could smell flowers. She always smelled of flowers, even when the city outside stank of burned wires. "You've seen him," she said without preface. Obi-Wan shook his head.
No.
But I know where he's gone. She closed her eyes. I have to go to him. Her hand lifted toward the place where the bag strap bit her shoulder and then fell again. He needs me. Padme, Obi-Wan said gently. He may need you. He may also hurt you. He stopped. Words like lost and fallen tasted useless. He is not himself. She opened her eyes. He told me once, she said, voice low, that he couldn't bear to lose me, that he would do anything. I know, Obi-Wan said. The ache of it, an old ache. That is the danger. She straightened. The mask of the senator slid over her face with the clean lines of a thing often practiced. Then we will be careful, she said. And we will try. She did not ask him to come with her. She did not have to. He followed her to the landing platform because that is what he had done his whole life. Walked beside impossible hope, let it set the pace, and tried to keep up. Mustafar was a world of open wounds. The sky was a dim lid over a basin where molten rock moved in slow, malevolent tides. The separatist leaders waited in a fortress like a hinge between fire and void, whispering reassurances to one another that they did not believe. When Vader came through their doors with his hood thrown up and his face made of stone, they remembered they had once believed in justice and let the memory kill them. He did not enjoy it. He did not savor the feel of their fear or the last flickering of their ambitions like moths on a window. He did it because his master had asked him to, because the doing would buy him the lesson he needed to save Padme, because stopping the war meant peace, and peace meant safety, and safety meant that the vision in his sleep would turn to smoke. When the last of them had fallen, he stood alone in a hall made of basalt and silence and listened to the planet breathe through its cracks. A ship came through the dirty air like a pale seed. He felt it before he saw it. He felt the shape of the mind within it the way one feels weather shift. Padme, bringing her gentle gravity across the gulf between impossible and done. He went out to meet her with his heart beating so hard it bruised his ribs from within. She came down the ramp with her cloak catching firelight, her braid shining at her temple. Behind her, at the top of the ramp, Obi-Wan stood like the piece of a past one tries to pack and cannot make fit. Anakin's mouth went dry. He had meant to hold Padme and tell her that it was over. He had meant to show her his hands and say, "These are the hands that will catch our child." He had meant to be simple when nothing else in him was simple. "Anakin," Padme said softly. She looked at his eyes, and what she saw there made her swallow. "Are you all right?" "I did what I had to," he said. The words tasted like ash. "For you. For our child." He reached for her hands. He felt Obi-Wan's gaze like a pressure on the side of his face. "We're safe now." Obi-Wan's voice came down the ramp, gentle and unarguable. "Anakin." Something in Anakin that had been standing on the edge of a cliff since the Chancellor's office turned and bared its teeth. "You," he said, and the word was an old story. "You left me with the Council's doubt. You sat on high chairs and told me to wait. You were never there when I needed you. You brought him here," he said to Padme, horror and fury braided. Padme shook her head, stepped toward him, palms up. "He came on his own. Ani, listen to me." Obi-Wan took one step onto the black stone and stopped where the ramp shadow reached. He lifted his hands away from his weapon and let them hang empty. "I came," he said, "because I saw the temple, and because I needed to see you. Anakin, some of the younglings, some are alive." Anakin felt the planet's heat shift. He had expected accusation. He had expected lectures about darkness and light. He had not expected this. The next breath burned. Padme's eyes widened. "What?" she whispered. "I found signs," Obi-Wan said. Yoda felt something spared where none expected. "Bail has some children aboard his ship now." He hesitated. "Did you?" "Yes," Anakin said. The admission left him abruptly, like a stone dropped from a hand. "I could not," he swallowed. "I could not." Padme's hands rose, trembling. She touched his chest with her fingertips as if he were a door that might open. Hope shot through her like clear water. "Then come home," she said fiercely. If you could do that, you can stop this. You can leave this place. We can protect them. We can protect our child and them and... My master, Anakin said, and the words felt like a collar tightening. Taught me how to save you. If I turn from him now, that knowledge dies. If I turn from him now, you die. I am not dead, Padme said. I am here. Feel me. He did. He felt her life like a candle cupped against the wind of this place, stubborn and warm and achingly fragile. He thought of waking in the middle of the night and laying his hand lightly where her skin grew over their child. He thought of her laughing. He thought of the way she slept curled to the edge of the bed as if she were ashamed of taking space. He could not bear the thought of that laughter dying in his hands. Obi-Wan stepped down another tread. The lava light made his face a map of compassion and sorrow. Anakin, he said, if you have spared them, then the man I know is still in you. Walk with me away from this. We will face whatever comes. Together. Together. The word snagged. They had said together on so many worlds. Together through rain on Kamino. Together through dust on Geonosis. Together in hangars that smelled like oil and fear. Together had meant you lead and I will follow, and then later it had meant we will walk side by side. Somewhere it had begun to mean you hold me back. Together, Anakin repeated, but it sounded like an old story he had already told. He shook his head once. I cannot. You do not know what I have seen. I know enough, Obi-Wan said. Padme's fingers on Anakin's chest pressed harder. Ani, she said, the childhood name falling from her mouth like a small bird that had forgotten how to fly. Please. It might have been possible then. The Force folded inward around him like a held breath. If he had said, I am sorry, and stepped away, if he had let the heat of Mustafar be just heat and not the echo of everything he had burned, perhaps the great dark wave gathering behind his eyes would have settled. Perhaps Padme would have breathed out and smiled, and the child would have turned in her with simple impatience. But the memory of Sidious's lightning crawled up his nerves again, a scalded map of terror. The vision of Padme's hand falling from a blood-dark sheet gripped his throat. The thought of retreat tasted like failure's final form. Obi-Wan saw it happen, and his face gentled and hardened at once. He did not reach for his saber. He reached for Anakin with his voice. I will not let him take you, he said simply. If I must, I will fight him in you. Something in Anakin that had spared children. Some small island of himself untouched by fire, snarled at the presumption of that love. His hand moved of its own accord. The Force obeyed his panic. Padme staggered backward with a gasp as invisible fingers closed around her throat. It took the half of a second the act required for horror to crash down over him. He released her as if she burned him. She crumpled to her knees on the black stone, clutching at the air, taking ragged breath after ragged breath. Anakin stood frozen with his hands open, staring at them as if the tendons belonged to someone else. I'm sorry, he said hoarsely. Padme, Padme. Obi-Wan's saber snapped to life. Blue light flared across his face. He did not advance. He placed himself between Padme and Anakin with the economy of a man who had practiced standing in the way of danger for a long time. His voice was steady, but wet at the edges with grief. Then stop, he said. The first clash of their blades sounded like the universe closing its eyes. They moved along the platform's edge, feet sure on treacherous stone. Obi-Wan yielded small spaces, turned Anakin's pressure aside, absorbed it, found the places where anger stumbled on its own momentum. Anakin pressed relentlessly anyway, because he could do nothing else. Their bodies remembered each other too well for trickery. Every feint became a conversation, every bind a personal history. Anakin, Obi-Wan said as they locked at the edge of a gantry, breath harsh. Listen, you spared children. If you can do that, stop saying that. Anakin hissed and struck. The gantry shuddered. Lava gaped beneath them, a black-red mouth. Steam sprayed up and salted their faces with mineral. The duel stretched across the facility's spine, through rooms where accounts had been tallied and orders issued, through a catwalk where the floor glowed red-hot in a grid of warning light. Machinery roared its own indifference. They cut cables and leapt fire and used their old shorthand to survive each other's strengths. Anakin landed a kick that sent Obi-Wan sliding toward a pit. Obi-Wan caught a pipe and swung back up, teeth clenched against a cry. They broke out onto a maintenance pier that drifted dangerously toward a slagfall. "Let it go," Obi-Wan panted. "Let him go." "I can't," Anakin said. He felt the words scrape his throat like a rasp. "If I do, she dies." "Then trust her," Obi-Wan said, despairing and exasperated and still somehow tender. "As she has always trusted you." They stared at each other, breathing hard. Something quivered between them like a wire drawn too tight. Anakin moved. Obi-Wan moved. The Force moved 1 degree to the left of where either of them wanted it. When it ended not because one was better than the other, but because the world on which they fought shifted under them. A section of gantry gave way with a scream. Obi-Wan leapt. Anakin followed. The pier caught and lurched. Their blades slid. Blue light bit human flesh. Anakin cried out, half a breath of shock. Then heat roared up and the smell of burned cloth and skin filled his mouth. Obi-Wan stood above him on the bank of black sand. Chest heaving, blade up because he knew how much one still breathes even as one falls. Anakin lay below at the edge of a drift that shone with heat. Hands clawed into the slag, face turned toward the impossible red sky. He was not yet in the fire. Obi-Wan could have reached. For a long, inhaled moment he almost did. He saw a boy with a shaved head and a grin like a small summer storm. He saw a man whose laughter had once been as startling as lightning in clear weather. He saw his failure. "I loved you," Obi-Wan said, and the sentence was not accusation but lament. He turned away because he had to keep the next thing alive. He went back for Padme, whose breath stuttered but did not stop, and carried her aboard her ship. When he looked back, he saw the silhouette of a shuttle cut through the ash-choked air and drop toward the black shore where Anakin's body lay. Darth Sidious gathered what was left of his apprentice with a miser's care. In a sterile room lit white as bone, machines stitched Anakin back into a shape that breathed. Metal fastened to him like an argument he could not win. When he woke, the world had been narrowed to a corridor down which Pain walked with the slow patience of a monk. He asked for Padme and Sidious told him a story, and Anakin's howl shook welds in the ceiling plates. In the quiet after, he thought of 14 children moving through old stone like fish through coral. He did not say their existence aloud. He kept them in his chest like embers cupped against cold. Bail Organa's ship ran silent through local space and then dove into the narrow mouth of a hyperspace lane. In the medical bay, Padme delivered 2 children who took their first breaths with their mother's name in the air. She named the boy and the girl in a voice that broke and then steadied. Obi-Wan held her hand while Yoda stood with his eyes closed, speaking softly under his breath to someone Obi-Wan could not hear. The old master's face was lit from within by a stillness that did not belong to this running world. "Qui-Gon," Yoda said afterward, almost as if to himself, when the babies slept in their little domes and the engines hummed like an animal. "A path through death found he has, a path through fear, find we must." They made their choices. They made their plans. They held the children and then let them go, each to a future braided around necessity and hope. The other children, the 14 from the stone cavern, were hidden on Alderaan in a school that was not a school. Bail and Breha found rooms where sunlight slanted across pale walls and filled them with the smell of ink and chalk and citrus peel. They hired nurses who knew how to keep quiet. They told no one what the children learned beneath the arithmetic and statecraft. How to breathe the way a Jedi breathes, how to listen to a room until it tells you where to stand. They taught them to carry themselves like citizens and to be ready one day to be something else. The Tholothian girl carried a new name like a coin in her pocket. The human boy learned to smooth his expression into nothing at will. Gungi grew with the patient, silent dignity of a tree in winter. T8 rolled down Alderaanian corridors like a small, nervous planet with squeaky wheels. Sometimes, late at night, the children dreamed of stone and smoke. Sometimes they dreamed of a blue blade that had filled a room with light and then gone out. Years slid like quiet knives under doors. The empire flowered with night-blooming roses that smelled of fear. Inquisitors with red blades hunted through the lanes of Coruscant and out along the scratched edge of the rim. Some of them remembered laughter. One remembered the taste of sweetened milk. None of them remembered mercy. Vader led them with the cold precision of someone who had given up the right to sleep through the night and wanted compensation in success. He did not reveal the children. He could not make himself speak their existence into the Emperor's listening. He forged records that contradicted one another. He edited footage to show bodies where there had been none. He learned the kind of lies that stand in the place of corpses. The Emperor, who trusted nothing but his own appetite, watched him with the curiosity of a scientist peering through glass at a dangerous specimen. "Your report on the temple is thorough," Sidious said one night. His voice scraped raw, the words stretching between them like a ligature. "Every initiate accounted for." "Yes, my master," Vader said. The respirator hissed at his back of his throat. The sound had become punctuation in his sentences. A comma where there had once been breath. "Except for these 14 anomalies," Sidious said mildly, establishing the fact of the Emperor's omniscience like a cat sets a paw on the back of a mouse. He gestured, and a hololist unfolded. Ages, species, crude silhouettes. Curious. Vader looked at the list. He had forged those numbers. He had bled for those lies. He let the quiet sit until it weighed down in the room like a pressure front. "They died," he said at last. "In the archive's fire." Sidious's smile moved and did not move. "Of course." On Alderaan, a class of children chanted the preamble to the Imperial Charter in a starchy chorus and then went back to a different lesson. How to set a glass on a table without moving the water inside. The Tholothian girl, Katuni to herself in the deep place where names remain true, held still until the meniscus trembled and made a tiny laugh at its own daring. The human boy, Petro, though no one had said that aloud for years, grinned and then remembered and made his face flat. Bail watched from a doorway with his hands behind his back and felt the ache of his duplicity stretch from his joints to his heart. He had always believed that the Republic could be saved. He had always believed. That daylight endured. Now he believed in the weight of a secret schoolroom and the price of keeping breath moving through small bodies. He went home to Breha, and she took his face in her hands and told him the story of hope like a bedtime ritual. They did this every night. Traded burdens like pastries, took bites, swallowed. Gungi learned to carve. There was little wood on Alderaan, but he accepted scraps from the palace carpenters and made small creatures out of them with a blade he kept wrapped in soft cloth. He carved a bird with its wings half lifted and set it on the windowsill where the snow sometimes piled around it. He carved a little figure with a short staff and wrinkled brow and hid it in a pocket sewn inside his tunic. Katuni went sometimes to the palace garden at night when the big lamps were dim and sat in the shadow of a marble angel and talked to the dark. "If you are there," she said once, eyes closed, palms open on her knees. "If anyone is there. If the stories are true, help me be brave when it matters. Help me keep the others alive. Let me know when to run and when to stay." She did not expect an answer. She did not get one, not then. The wind made the leaves hiss. High in the clean Alderaanian sky, a transport cut across the stars like a needle threading black cloth. On Coruscant, Vader stepped down into a warehouse where an informant waited with news like meat. The man stank of fear and a cheap cologne strong enough to make the air taste sweet. He told a story about a nest of surviving Jedi in a utility sublevel near the old art districts, a story with dates and proof of life, a story that had probably been purchased with 3 separate betrayals. Vader killed him when he finished the story, because some liars must be paid in full. He took 2 purge trooper squads with him and an inquisitor who had been a temple guard and now told himself he had become more than he had been by removing his face. They found a cellar full of beds and books and no Jedi. They found a small carved bird on a sill, wings half lifted, staring at a square of sky that belonged to everyone and no one. The Inquisitor picked it up and turned it in his fingers and looked at Vader as if the object might be an accusation. "Scraps," Vader said, and the vocoder made the word scrap metal. He took the little bird and set it down on a barrel lid and crushed it under his glove, because sometimes one must tell one's own heart the truth with one's hands. The children grew. They learned statecraft under another name. They learned to bow and to nod and to survive being looked at by people who might kill them. They learned to hide their light like a slow match under damp tinder. Sometimes one of them would ask Bail a question he could not answer. Is Master Skywalker dead? Did he die in the temple? Did he kill us and then stop? Bail would look at the child's face and think of a young man with a shambling grin walking too fast through the Senate concourse, oblivious to glances, bent on love like an errand. He would choose his words with care, the way one chooses water in a desert. I think he tried, he would say, and let the sentence end there. In the quiet that followed, hope and grief could share a cup without choking. News wore its thin shoes around the galaxy. Whispers grew spines and jumped system to system. A farm boy on Tatooine looked out over sand at sunset and felt that something had once been true. A girl on Alderaan grew up between silk and steel and learned how to make questions into weapons. On a small, foregone world, a hermit moved through his days with a gentleness that disguised vigilance and spoke sometimes to the air, asking for guidance in a voice that belonged to a younger man. Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan would say in the hour before dawn, I do not know if I am doing any of this right. At his feet, the sand remembered water the way old bones remember flesh. The horizon reddened with an austere beauty that made the back of his throat ache. Sometimes the wind answered in a language no one living spoke. Sometimes he heard laughter like a bell in another room. Sometimes he heard nothing and let the nothing be his teacher. One night, years after Mustafar, Vader stood at the edge of a viewport in a star destroyer with the stars held in a grid of meaning before him, and thought of a room in the temple with blue light and small hands and the sound of his own voice saying, if you obey, you might live. He could not sleep. He did not need to sleep, but sometimes he missed the complicated intimacy of it. He missed the way Padme's breath had made a small hill beneath his hand. The door behind him slid open with caution disguised as protocol. The Grand Inquisitor entered and bowed with an angle measured to the degree. My lord, he said. Rumors have reached us of a sect on Alderaan. Not Jedi, of course not Jedi, but a philosophy school with unusual exercises. The children learn to control breath. They meditate. They speak of peace with a certain vocabulary. The air around Vader cooled. Alderaan is loyal. Of course, the Inquisitor said smoothly. We speak only of rumors, but sometimes rumors are like weeds. One must tug at them before the roots run too deep. He paused. Or like children. Vader's fist tightened before he made it relax. He could feel the exact machine of his grip. The small were in his knuckles, the way pressure could be measured in kilopascals and applied like math. He turned away from the viewport. I will investigate Alderaan myself, he said. You will remain with your squads along the outer rim routes. There are scraps there to collect. The Inquisitor bowed again, this time deeper, and left with the secretive frustration of a man denied an anticipated meal. A short time later, a shuttle emerged from hyperspace on the near side of a pale planet. Alderaan lay before Vader like a myth of forgiveness. Snow on peaks, water braided like silk through green folds, cities that sat lightly on land as if to ask permission to remain. He had flown over landscapes like this once with the particular hunger that lightheartedness brings. Now he felt nothing except a slow, dangerous warmth behind his ribs that he refused to name. He landed in a private bay with credentials that parted doors as if they were made of mist. Bail Organa met him with a smile carved carefully from courtesy and iron. They walked together through halls that smelled of citrus and clean stone. Guards stood at polite attention. Banners moved in the climate's soft breath. My lord, Bail said in his public voice, Alderaan welcomes you. We are honored. Vader's respirator answered on his behalf. He signed the book presented to him, his glove leaving no trace of oils the way a living hand would. He let Bail make small talk about trade routes and tariffs. He watched the man's hands and saw no tremor. Your schools are impressive, Vader said at last. We believe in education, Bail said simply. It is the most peaceful of weapons. They were shown a classroom. Children sat before a slate faced with lines and numbers. A teacher in a modest blue dress asked a question about fractions. Small fingers lifted. In the back corner, a Wookiee carved quietly at a twist of driftwood. His tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. The teacher gently removed the blade from his hand and set it aside with a look that was patient and not unkind. Vader stood and watched and felt the room the way one feels an old scar under weather. The children's breaths were even. Their pulses were steady. No one looked at him directly for more than a heartbeat. He found no ripple in the force here that might betray training, and if there was a ripple, he did not reach for it with his senses. He could have touched the air and felt where it struck a human hand and returned altered. He could have found the Tholothian girl's stillness the way a hunter finds a spring in desert. He could have marked the human boy with the flat face and the tight tendons. He could have turned his head to the corner and let pain flood him at the sight of a Wookiee's careful hands. He did not. He turned away. "Satisfactory," he said, the word heavy as a locked door. In the hall afterward, Bail walked with him to the platform. Sunlight lay across the floor like cloth. They stood together for a breath longer than protocol demanded. Bail's face tilted toward the light for that breath, the way a plant turns toward what makes it. "Senator," Vader said. "My lord." "Keep them safe," Vader said, and the respirator turned the word them into a skeleton of itself. "The Empire prospers when its citizens are educated." Bail inclined his head. "We agree." They did not say more. They carried their shared secret between them like a heavy bowl that must not be dropped. Walked slowly, set it down, backed away without breaking eye contact, and left the room. When Vader's shuttle lifted, Katuni, who had been in the shadow behind the classroom's curtained doorway with her breath held quiet and her heart held quieter, let herself kneel at last and let her spine sag. Petro touched her shoulder and then snatched his hand back. The Wookiee, taller now, his furs thickened, exhaled a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a prayer. "What now?" Petro whispered. "Now," Katuni said, and there was both weariness and a fierce, spare joy in her voice. "We keep being alive." In the years that followed, more rumors gathered like rain around a mountain's peak. A rebellion began to write itself in small writings. Whispers in ports, half-smiles on planets. Supplies gone missing and showing up where they were needed. The children from the temple grew into faces the Empire's cameras sometimes missed and sometimes caught in the corner of a frame. They learned to stand in a crowd and be a crowd. They learned, when necessary, to stand alone. Vader heard of them sometimes as reports filtered up through officers who wished to impress him. A cell on Brental that escaped a trap by seconds. A sabotage on Lot Hal with a signature too elegant to be a fluke. A Wookiee who had been seen at a relief depot, carving toys for displaced children with a small, careful knife. He said nothing. He cut no new orders. He studied the stars and told himself that the tremor inside his chest cavity was only a machine's minor imbalance, an issue for technicians. In the very late hours, when the ship was as quiet as anything so large can be, he would go to his quarters and let the mask be lifted and the dome released. He would sit with the darkness that had a temperature but no scent, and breathe the mechanical air that kept him alive. If he closed his eyes, he could sometimes hear a room full of children breathing, and his own voice saying, "If you obey, you might live." Sometimes he let himself imagine another world in which he had obeyed someone else, or no one at all. In that world, Padme's laughter gathered in the corners of a room like light. In that world, a boy with his eyes and a girl with her mother's mouth ran through a meadow on Alderaan, while a Wookiee shaped a bird from wood, and a Tholothian young woman advised a queen. In that world, Obi-Wan's hand touched his shoulder in greeting and not goodbye. In that world, the temple did not burn. He opened his eyes. Stars hung where stars always hung, pinned to a grid his navigators understood. The respirator filled the room with tide. He did not move. He did not sleep. He listened until listening became a form of penance and kept listening after that, because mercy returns in circles if one lets it. On a day when two suns set and the Empire looked, to itself, eternal, a young woman in white stood before a droid and fed it a secret that would change the galaxy. She had learned to stand like that from a lifetime of watching people carry fragile weights. When she turned to run, in her bones there was a memory of a schoolroom where children learned how to carry water without making the surface move. Somewhere else, deeper, there was the whisper of a blue blade turning off in a room full of small breaths. She did not know what that memory was. She did not need to. Not long after, on a world of dust, a farm boy would look at a sunset and choose to leave home. A man in a brown robe would feel the old laughter in his chest and tell himself to be brave where it mattered. A dark figure would stand on a deck and feel 14 small breathing spaces like lanterns kept alive under bowl after bowl until the day they could be lifted clear. The force, which made and unmade the world with the indifference of gravity and the tenderness of rain, curled around all of it. It remembered a choice in a high room on a night full of smoke, a blade not raised, a wall opened, a handful of children sent into old stone. It remembered a man whose name had become a machine and who nevertheless, in the moment between orders, had spared what he could. And when breath left one body and entered another, when names fell away and were taken up again, when light moved where shadow had once moved, the memory remained, a small, stubborn warmth in a vast cold. The promise that even in a life bent toward ruin, some small act can alter the shape of the dark enough to let someone else pass through. The corridor of the Tantive Four locked around him like a memory made of angles and smoke. White armored troopers flooded through the ruptured hatch, blaster lights stuttering against walls blown open to vacuum a heartbeat before the emergency seals snapped into place. Bodies fell and slid and struck the deck with notes that seemed too small for death. Vader moved through it without haste, the cape at his heels an obedient shadow. His breathing measured the distance between seconds. When a rebel in a smoke-streaked helmet fired point-blank into the black mask, the bolts bent away as if the air had turned to glass. They brought the princess to him with her wrists locked and her chin lifted like a small flag in wind. The first thing that struck him was the particular geometry of her face, the clean logic of cheekbones, the stubbornness of her mouth. The second was the way the force curved around her presence, quiet and strong, like stone under water. He did not reach toward that curve with his senses. He did not look for what his hands could not bear to touch. "You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor," he said, the vocoder giving the words a formality that insulated him from the memory of a softer voice that had once said, "Your anger is a door. Take her away." He watched her only as far as the turn of the corridor, until she vanished into the white glare and the sharp footsteps of soldiers swallowed the moment. In the quiet afterwards he looked down and saw, at his bouthiel, a small piece of twisted metal. It had once been a droid's connector, bent and burned into an abstract shape that resembled a bird with a broken wing. He ground it into the deck with a deliberate pressure, and the ruined shape became ruin without metaphor. He told himself that in the empire of his mind there would be no small objects arranged against him like altars. Far away, where light fell across the marbled slopes of Alderaan like clear cloth, children trained in rooms where the desks were arranged with a mathematician's ambition toward symmetry. The morning smelled of chalk and citrus peels, of wool brushed smooth by careful hands. Katuni sat with her back straight and her palms flat upon the desk's surface, feeling the minuscule tremor of her pulse against the wood. She was almost grown now. The beads at her temples chimed with the lightest movement, a whisper of sound the room swallowed and kept. Petro behind her had a smear of ink on his wrist where he had rubbed at a mistake until it went gray. Gungi's fur had picked up a bit of sawdust from the workbench where, in the moments between lessons, he carved a small animal with a blade wrapped in cloth. He had not yet decided what creature it would be. He was waiting until the wood's grain told him. Their teacher, a woman with steady hands and a star map's patience, wrote fractions on a slate board and then paused. She stood very still and turned her head as if listening to a sound only she could hear. The world turned white. It was not light the way light usually comes, with a source and a direction. It was an event, a fact, a perfect noon that ate its own shadow. The walls shuddered. The tea in a porcelain cup jittered outward into a thin, perfect ring and then lifted, every drop becoming a separate sphere that hung for a heartbeat in defiance of gravity, and then fell in glittering rain across the desk. The flux lamps blew with a series of neat pops. A bead fell from Katuni's temple and struck the wood with an absurdly polite tick. Petro's stylus rolled, fell, hit the floor silently because the air itself had gone to hush. Gungi's knife stopped halfway through a cut that would have made a tail. They did not hear the voices in the force as individual screams because the human ear cannot conceive of that many throats at once. They felt a pressure sweep through the room and through their bodies, like a great hand moving water. Katuni's breath caught. It occurred to her with clarity that pain could be so enormous that it no longer resembled pain. The teacher's hand found the edge of the desk. Her knuckles went white. She lifted her gaze to the window and saw nothing that made sense of the sensation. Alderon's sky was as clear as always. The mountain held its patient blue. Outside, someone began to cry in a hallway, and the sound hit Katuni at the level of bone. Bail Organa was not there to see it. He stood on the bridge of a ship that had no sigils, speaking quietly to a captain who had learned to keep his eyes where they belonged, and watched a dot on a star chart that stood for home. The dot did nothing. It existed in its place. He did not see it turn white. He felt his knees consider the floor and refused them. "Breha," he said under his breath, "her name a river in drought." "Sir?" the captain asked, looking up at the cold in the senator's tone. "We will proceed," Bale said, "because the only thing to do with silence that sighs is to cut it into tasks and swallow it bite by bite." He moved to the chronometer, tapped a code into a panel, sent a message inside a message that would scatter like seeds along agreed-upon coordinates. A schoolroom's doors sealed. A nurse knelt with her arms around a boy she had never birthed. In a storage bay, T8 emitted a single, raw, long tone and then went quiet as a lamp with a blanket thrown over it. On the Death Star, Tarkin drew his lips thin around satisfaction and sipped at it like a bitter liqueur. He watched the telemetry scroll. He watched Leia's face with an interested disappointment when she understood, so late, what he intended. Vader stood beside him, a black needle pinned to the carpet, the respirator making the room's only rhythm. A small, treacherous part of him thought, there are 14 breathing in secret somewhere on that world. Another voice, the one he used for survival, said, "You do not know that. They could be gone already, hidden aboard a shuttle, folded into Alderaanian routine like a thread too subtle to see, scattered along lanes where you will never find them." The white glare flowered. The metal bones of the station carried the vibrational echo of that death like a bell ringing only along beams. "You are far too trusting," Tarkin was saying to the princess, as if the word trust were not itself a creature he had hunted to extinction. "Dantooine is too remote to make an effective demonstration." Vader said nothing. He stood and did not move, and if he had a body, he might have been sick. In his recollection, sand blew across a Tatooine horizon and stung his eyes. In another recollection, Padme's laughter spilled across an apartment on Coruscant like warm water. In a third, 14 children slipped through a seam in the wall, breathing with the deliberate restraint of prey. Somewhere in the ruined syntax of what once had been his heart, he repeated a sentence until it smoothed into something he could swallow. "If you obey, you might live." Leia did not break. She slid her eyes to the viewport for an instant in which the world where she had played and taken oaths and kissed her mother's cheek had become light, and then back to Tarkin with hatred that remained, somehow, precise. "You're frightened," she said quietly, and he smiled because fear was his favorite kind of belonging. It happened, then, the way it was always going to happen. Obi-Wan and the boy moved through hallways where the air tasted faintly of metal fat and old coolant. On a wide platform above a gulf into which reactors breathed, Vader felt a presence like rain in a country that had forgotten weather. "I sense something," he told the void around him, and for a moment he was a young man again, bright with certainty, and then certainty became a strange form of grief. When Obi-Wan lowered his blade and closed his eyes, the old man's face held a serenity the mask could not understand. The blade fell, the robe collapsed, the boy shouted, and something burned that was not any known kind of heat. In the immediate quiet after the explosion over Yavin, the space around Vader's tie felt like absence with a sound. He spun in the debris field with a cold precision that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with being alive when others were not. The shock of the station's death ran through him like a broken cord. He slowed just enough to take one ragged breath that belonged to Anakin Skywalker and not to the shape that bore his name. "The Force is strong with him," he had said as the green laser stitched its logic into the trench like a sentence. He had not spoken the rest aloud, and it felt like looking into a mirror that showed me the face I lost. He set his jaw, an operation both physical and ritual, and calculated a trajectory that would take him to a place where his master's rage would be spread across an entire fleet and therefore survivable. At Yavin, Leia stood on the dais with her hands wrapped around a metal ribbon and thought, while the cheering filled the temple hall, of the white that had devoured a world. The metals flashed where the light reached them like small deliberate suns. She placed one around Luke's neck and another around Han Solo's and maintained the composure Alderaan had taught her, because composure kept people at the helm long enough to land the ship. Chewbacca stood with his head high. Beyond his shoulder, near the hall's far door, a Wookiee a head shorter pressed his back against a stone pillar to keep from falling. Gungi's breath sawed in and out. The room smelled of oil and flowers and metal polish. He was not old enough to remember Kashyyyk's victory parade at the end of a harvest, the way the drums had once crawled up the spine like joy, but something in him recognized the particular shape of ceremony in a hall of stone. He lifted the small carved bird in his pocket and pressed it hard into his palm until the wood's edges bit skin. Katuni stood beside him with her chin down as if watching her own boots, and Petro looked everywhere at once as if making himself the map of a place would keep him from becoming a coordinate in someone else's targeting computer. When the ceremony ended and the tide of bodies moved toward the doors, a woman in white passed close. Leia's eyes slid over faces as if gathering them into a basket. She would not forget them. That was one of her gifts and one of her burdens. The Lothian girl with the beads. If she had been older, Leia might have missed her for a courtier from a forgotten province. The Wookiee whose hands kept folding on themselves as if looking for something gentle to do. The human boy with his mouth set stubborn, who wore his grief like a blade hidden under his shirt. Leia recognized the hush around them. She knew the artifact's smell of secrecy. She looked away before recognition became responsibility, but later, when she sat with Jana Tillis and Jan Dodonna in a room that smelled of ink and sweat and a new theory of winning, she remembered them and wrote their faces in her mind under a single word, mine. They returned to work. Work is the particular courtesy the living pay the dead. The falcon slid away in that looping style of flying that always made the stomach consider its options. Luke walked alone where the jungle's damp breathed up from the ground. Leia conferred and then conferred again, and then smiled a smile that made half the room straighten as if they had been seen and endorsed instead of evaluated. Katuni slept little. In dreams she saw a wind moving through halls and displacing banners. She saw a seam in stone seal itself with a sigh. She woke with the sense that someone had closed a door behind them from the other side with a promise that sounded like a command. Mon Mothma came to Yavin like the white frame of an argument that had already convinced the room. She spoke quietly and never repeated herself, and people repeated her anyway because they could not help it. Breathing, sleeping, planning. The days braided together into a rope they could use to climb away from despair's pit. In a corner of a requisitions room that smelled like boiled shirts, T8 sat with a corrupted data core from the Death Star's southern staging hangar, nudged it over and over with a logic pick shaped like a faint hope, and whistled to its own circuits in satisfaction when it found a surviving slice of the station's personnel logs. Some of the names flickered and went dark. One or two persisted like stains. T8 filed them where another droid might find them later and kept rolling. In the months that followed, the 14 folded themselves into the Rebel Alliance as a needle folds into cloth with such precision that only those who look for the stitch can find it. Gungi learned from Wedge Antilles how to read a pilot's rhythm and tell, by the way a voice flattened at the ends of sentences, whether a trench run would end in light or fire. He never went up himself. He had grown clever about the lines the Empire watched, and large non-human pilots whose names could be written in block capitals were often tracked with extra care. He sat instead at the back of hangars and carved in secret, leaving small wooden figures in places where hands would find them on unlucky days. A bird with one wing half-lifted left on a nurse's cart. A resultingly ugly, affectionate attempt at her 2D2 set on a tool chest. A short, stern man with a beard and gentle eyes, tucked one morning into a pocket on Luke's flight jacket where the young man did not find it until after he had returned from a routine run and laughed in a single helpless bark, and then put it away in a place he did not tell anyone about. Petro learned patience like a language. He carried messages between cells by routes so devious that sometimes he lost himself and had to trust his feet. He moved through markets and spaceports as if his bones had learned the exact gait of a man with nothing to sell. His anger was not gone. He wore it like an amulet and taught it better manners. When a stormtrooper shoved him hard against a Duracrete wall hard enough to bruise his ribs, he let the wave of fury break against his training and recede. He thought of a blue blade that had turned off with a sound like mercy. He looked down, he nodded, he moved on, he lived. Katuni did what Katuni had always done. She listened, and then she stood where the room's sound told her to stand. She met with Senna Recchio and Hera Syndulla and played courier for Mon Mothma on days when the safest hands were the ones no one knew to watch. She learned to fix a hyperdrive gasket with a spoon and a length of ribbon. She learned from a Celestin mechanic how to smile with her eyes and not her mouth. On a ship with plates worn smooth by generations of feet, she accepted from an older Twi'lek a scarf that had been a banner in another, Kinder era, and wore it under plain coats like a vow whose words were none of anyone's business. Sometimes, when she had crossed too many lanes in too little time and the ships felt like indifferent gods with appetites, she walked to the edge of a landing platform on a salvage moon and let the cold pull heat from her skin. She thought then of Master Skywalker, not the monster whose name now terrified entire sectors, but the man whose blade had hummed in the council chamber for the space of a breath and then gone dark. Her gratitude was complicated and clean at once. She carried it the way one carries a lucky coin. Never flashed, always near. He felt them sometimes in the nights when the ship's noises were repairs in search of failures. They were like warmth remembered by old stone, the suggestion of breath in a room long sealed. Sidious asked him occasionally, in that slithering tone that made deference into mockery, whether he had any further information about the anomalies in the temple records. Vader would incline his head. "All accounted for, my master," he would say, and something behind the words would hold perfectly still until the old reptile turned his gaze elsewhere. Time measured itself in systems recovered and bases lost, in propaganda broadcasts and whispered jokes whose laughter sounded like defiance disguised as coughing. The Empire increased pressure on the lines anyone could see. The rebellion moved along lines no one could draw. In the white halls of Cloud City, where the air smelled faintly of sterilized fruit and the windows showed a sky like a gentleman's glove, a trap set its teeth. Lando Calrissian hated the way capitulation looked on him but wore it anyway because surviving one more day sometimes means wearing clothes you despise. Katuni knew they were being watched 10 minutes after they walked off the freighter. She knew it the way one knows the presence of a storm. The hairs on her arms altered their posture and sound fell into the measured cadence of rehearsed lies. She tilted her head once toward Gungi and Petro and they moved, as they had been taught, like a trio of people with different worries. When Chewbacca lifted a disassembled droid and howled and hurled insults in a dialect guttering with emotion, Gungi's jaws clenched as if the sound had been a bite. He could not go to him. He could not touch the taller Wookiee in a public hallway full of eyes. He could not reveal the shape their lives had taken because of someone's mercy. He stood, therefore, and let his own throat close around the soft, ululating howl he had learned not to make, and closed his eyes for 2 slow breaths, and then opened them and went where Katuni's glance sent him. To the East Maintenance Corridor, second junction, right-hand service door that sounded slightly different when its seal failed to catch the way a melody's one wrong note burns in the ear. There he found a panel and, behind it, a tangle of wires that sang in clashing keys. He cut the proper hum. It would not stop the man in black from playing his game on a flat dining room table and saying we would be honored if you would join us as if hospitality could be a weapon, but it would slow the lockdown 3 precious minutes later when men with blasters made their calculation of worth and waste. In that space, Katuni laid a path with her breath for Han Solo to run. He did not take it, of course. He chose Leia, and that, Katuni told herself grudgingly, was one of the rare correct decisions of men like him. They saw him there, the black figure in the bright room, the past walking in present tense. Petro drew in air as if he had been hit. Katuni put her hand on his wrist. The touch was grounding as a knot in rope when one hand has nothing else to hold. Vader's mask turned a fraction, as if catching a scent he half recognized. The angle of the helmet's gaze paused on the doorway's shadow in which Katuni stood utterly still. Here, at last, would be consequence. She braced herself for hands on her shoulders, for the hot weight of attention, for the moment the history of mercy would lift and show its price. The black helmet turned back to Solo and Organa, and the roar of carbonite filled the hallway. The lift doors closed. Petro sagged with relief that made his legs briefly unreliable. Katuni let out a breath like a promise kept too long and rearranged her face's muscles into a different woman's expression and walked away. Afterward, when Luke brought the sky's wind with him into the city's inner rooms and fear tasted like metal in the molars, Katuni slipped once more through a seam, down a stair, through a vent, across a bridge where the only cover was nothing. She dove into a repair bay where a 2D2 cursed in binary so fast even T8 would have blushed, and threw one small switch before a stormtrooper's shadow fell across the floor like an absence. The door next to the little astromech opened smooth as courtesy. The small miracle might have saved a life. She did not wait to see if it had. She was already moving, her breath counting cadence for her feet. An hour later she stood at a viewport watching a small craft become a smaller dot against cloud and told the air, which did not need to know, that she was tired of running. On the Executor, Vader stood at a different viewport and did not move for a long time. The cut on his shoulder where Luke's blade had bitten sketched heat across meat that should not have felt. The words had already happened. He had reached out his hand across that fathom of air and said them. He had watched the boy fall and understood an old logic with a new geometry. The leap of faith is sometimes the only move left for those who have lost an argument with themselves. He felt, then, another absence in the Force, a quiet point where someone who had once been a little though Lothian girl now stood very still in a shaft of emergency lighting. He did not seek her. He stood like a man listening to rain which may or may not be there, and did not speak the name he did not know but almost remembered. Between battles, in a space stolen from necessity, Yoda sat on a log in a world that had made a profession of rot and closed his eyes. Mist braided his white hair into small ropes. The little cookpot burbled. He was neither asleep nor awake as others would define it. He was in the place where the Force becomes a sea without horizon and memory glides along its surface like birds that never tire. Qui-Gon, he said into that warmth which was not warmth. Much remains. A boy who falls and rises, a father whose breath is borrowed, a seed hidden in rubble. The answer was not sound but the absence of loneliness. Yoda nodded as if to someone sitting across the fire whose shape he could almost see. He said, which meant, yes, and also, perhaps, and also, keep walking. Leia did not speak of Alderaan often. When she did, it was with an exactitude that made some listeners put their hands on the table to keep balance. Katuni listened once while repairing a frayed uniform cuff. They were in a staging bay on a forgotten rock with a dozen other people doing important and trivial things at once, and Leia said simply, from the high road above the southern falls you could smell the pine gum on your skin for hours afterward. And Katuni swallowed because the specificity was a form of faith. A nameless pilot with grease under his nails asked, awkwardly, was your family? And Leia moved her gaze to the work in Katuni's hands and said, in a tone that did not request pity and would not accept it, my mother's name was Breha. She wore a ring whose stone was older than our city. She never took it off. She did not add, except once, to place it in a small drawer as a joke and then laugh when she could not remember which drawer and went searching like a girl and not a queen. Katuni finished the stitch and bit off the thread and thought of a day the sun turned white. News moved at a different pace as the net tightened. Supply lanes narrowed. Safe harbors turned into traps overnight. They went to Hoth because cold was honest, and there one could see one's breath go out and return. Katuni learned with Leia how to move through halls where the ceilings wept. Petro learned to sleep with his boots on, and the first words on his tongue became "I'm here" instead of "what now." Gungi thrived in the cold like a tree that had outgrown its pot and set its roots in snow. When the walkers came, when the sound like bone under an avalanche filled the long tunnel and the floor itself quivered with mechanical footfalls, Katuni thought with an odd, distracted clarity of drill sessions in the temple when the alarm would ring with sleepy politeness and initiates would stream in robes and bare feet along warm floors to stand in rows and count. 2, 4, 6, 8. A master had said once, rye in the mouth, the Empire's favorite numbers. She snorted at the memory as she ran. Humor sometimes is the only currency that buys breath. They escaped in their different ways. The Falcon carried its private storm. Leia, looking out at the white broken into hurricane, told herself things she could not believe yet and would have to believe later. Luke went to Dagobah with a hunger like a wintering animal's. Katuni slid to a smaller rendezvous point with a clutch of medics and a single crate of precious hypoj that smelled like citrus and electricity when broken. She spent a night crammed into a crawl space with 6 strangers, the air tasting of wool and fear. In that tight darkness a child began to cry, very softly, and Katuni slid a hand onto the floor to find the little foot and press, carefully, until the child's breath slowed. When, hours later, she could risk saying anything at all, she murmured, "The temple remembers." And the words were a bridge between 2 shores no map recorded. On Bespin, she had kept herself unseen. On Endor, hiding would not do. The forest took their weight and gave back sound. Those long, resonant notes that trees make when they are older than empires. The air smelled of resin and loam. Ewoks watched from shadowed platforms as the rebel strike team moved past like deer who had convinced themselves they were wolves. Chewbacca's pleasure at being among trees nearly defeated his discipline. Gungi felt it in his spine like a drum. Katuni had argued her way onto the team with the clean logic of someone who had been steeling herself for this moment for years. "You don't trust me because you don't know me?" she told General Solo, who tipped his head as if to say that trusting or not wasn't part of the budget. "But you trust people who trust me. That will have to be enough." He had shrugged because sometimes it had to be. Leia's look had been steadier and less polite. Said, "Do not die because of pride. Do not live because of fear." Katuni bowed her head a fraction in acknowledgement and shouldered her pack. Their path through the underbrush was a series of negotiations between human ankles and water-slick roots. When the speeder bike screamed, light striped the trunks and death arrived with its usual interest and haste. Katuni stayed on the ground while Leia took the sky. Han swore with the relish of a man who knew how to make profanity into ballast. Luke's blade went up in the green gloom and made a strange, profound sense of the space it occupied. Somewhere in the forest's layered smell, Katuni recognized the exact scent of sap cut by a hot E. Dajan thought for an incoherent moment of the ice smell a saber makes when it moves through damp air. She laughed, a short, astonished bark, at the consistency of certain pleasures. They were taken and they were freed and they were taken again, as is the way of such operations. The shield generator stood like a boast among ferns. The path to it was simple and therefore untrustworthy. Gungi went with Chewbacca to the walker because there is a kind of joy peculiar to enormous machines that Wookiees cannot refuse. Petro went with Han to the back door because there is a kind of problem with locks that young men think must be their destiny. Katuni went with Leia because that was where the room sound put her. Some bargains are made not in words but in the way 2 people look at the same tree and see the path behind it. Inside, alarms nickered like nervous horses. The smell of ozone competed with the warm iron scent of blood from a bent knuckle no one remembered scraping. Katuni slid along a wall, counted breath, broke the rhythm deliberately because constancy can be tracked, and watched Leia fire with the particular poise that made her whole body appear to be the gun's logic. Stormtroopers fell like punctuation marks. Somewhere to their left an Ewok screamed a sound like a laugh with its skin turned inside out. The floor shuddered. Petro whooped. He had found a way to tell a door a lie and have it believe him. Then, a minute later, you could have heard a bead drop as everything in the world took a held breath. Above, on the second Death Star, where smell had been designed out of existence and light fell without tiring, a boy in black stood before A's burned-out window of a man and made a terrible choice. To walk with his hands open and give himself to the dark because that was the only road back into the light left to him. Vader felt him like gravity. He felt him through the floor, through the vast throat of the station, where the Emperor's laughter traced filthy patterns on the air. He went to him with steps that would have been slow, if slowness had not been a luxury. The door opened on hinges that the station pretended it did not have. They spoke. The words are in the record the way certain kinds of weather are in stories told to children. Father. Son. Come with me. It is too late. There is good in you. Words which, in other mouths, would have been accidents. The Emperor watched patience and hunger war in a small space and picked his moment the way a chef chooses flame. And then there was only pain. Vader took it because that is what he had been made to do, to take what others could not survive and live inside it like an address no one else can find. But this was a different pain, shaped with care to find every nerve he had left and touch it with a cold tongue. He made no sound. The respirator made sound for him. Luke's body writhed under the blue-lit assault. The air tasted of singed hair and the bitter metal of blood from a bitten lip. The Emperor's voice unspooled silkily about the boy's doom. Between pulses of lightning, between breaths measured for him by a machine, Vader had a thought that was not the language of his master and not the language of whoever Anakin used to be. It was not a thought with a subject and verb. It was a small, stubborn warmth like a coal taken from an old fire that had seemed to die. He saw, superimposed on Luke's face, as if the present were a lens focusing the past, 14 small figures slipping through stone in a room where his hand had lowered and a blade had gone dark. He had spared them because he could not endure the opposite. If he could not endure this either, then there was nothing left in him that deserved the name. He moved. The electricity stepped into him like a swarm of glass insects. He lifted the Emperor because he had always been able to lift things no one else could, and he held the man overhead like a faulty instrument. The old body flared with light and stench and false thunder. Vader walked with the weight in his arms, and the force skirled around them both like applause from a hostile audience and threw the Emperor down a shaft so long even gravity thought twice. He fell with him. Later, Luke would say no, stand with me, and the machine would say yes, stand for another short while. Later, Luke would lift his father's faceplate and show him his son with the dawn on him. Later, he would say, I have to save you, and Vader would say, you already have. But before those words found their spot in the world, there was a brief quiet in which another voice that belonged to no one living said to Yoda, far away, well done. The old green creature smiled in a way that made his face new. On Endor, when the shield fell and the dish fountained light and the control room came apart like a correction, Katuni stood with her palms flat against the cool wall and felt something open. It was not the door in the council chamber. It was something larger, a change in the weather that had been approaching for years. She let her head fall forward for a single indulgent moment, and then turned toward Leia, who was picking herself up with a face that told every muscle to remember what dignity is. Status, Leia said, and Katuni's response was a short list because short lists save time. Outside, Ewoks laughed with a ferocity that made their eyes shine. Chewbacca's arms lifted a smaller being up and made of the motion a hymn. Petro slumped against a console and let out a bark of laughter that startled himself into embarrassment, which in turn made him grin. Gungi wiped at his face with the heel of his hand and left a streak of soot that would remain there all day like a mark of tribe. The night filled with drums. Smoke climbed straight into a sky where something enormous had gone from tooth to ash. Music made a language of gratitude and grief. Katuni sat on a log with her knees up and her elbows on them and watched flames answer the air. Leia stood in the circle of the tribe's reverence with relaxation in her shoulders that looked new even to those who had watched her every day. Han laughed without bracing. Luke stepped into the clearing with more quiet than any one person should be able to carry and sat down with the others as if he had been away a lifetime and come back to a room that remembered his shape. Katuni caught his eye for a heartbeat. He looked away, not courtesy, instinct. There was too much in his face and she had not earned looking into it. He came to her later, when the circle had loosened and the fire had stopped throwing sparks like stinging flies. T8 chirped from the lap of a curious Ewok who kept patting the droid's dome and receiving patience in exchange. "You were at Yavin," Luke said, and Katuni smiled, surprised. "I remember you at the back of the hall. I thought you were a courtier." "I was a student," she said. "I still am." He nodded. "The best kind." He hesitated. "You move like Ahsoka Tano." The name fell into the air like a bird certain of its wings. Katuni felt it in her chest, an ache and a joy intertwined. "She took us for our crystals on Ilum," Katuni said. "Her laugh is a lesson." Luke smiled. "She was my father's student once." Katuni raised her chin. They had agreed, those of them who knew, that they would not volunteer the story of the council chamber unless asked by hands that could hold it. Luke Skywalker had fought his father and redeemed him and sent a tyrant to fire. He had earned the right if anyone had. "He saved us," she said simply. "When it mattered, he made a door for us and told us to go." Luke closed his eyes briefly the way a man does when light hits him too hard. "Thank you," he said, as if the information were a gift, as if the gift had weight that his hands were glad to feel. "Thank him," Katuni said gently, and Luke nodded, as if that had already been tried and also succeeded and also hurt. They burned the old shape of a man who had been many names on a pyre on a small black-sanded shore. The air smelled of wet wood and old salt. Luke stood with the other living and then alone as the fire took the mask and the mask took the light. In the air behind him or beside him, as if the world's dimensions had been rented and rewritten, 3 figures stood as if for a portrait. An old man in brown whose eyes smiled, a little green creature whose ears lifted slightly in pride, and a slender man with a young face who looked at Luke with a tenderness that did not belong to any empire. Qui-Gon had taught those two how to make their voices carry past the horizon. The third did not speak with a voice so much as with the absence of the machine that had measured his life into punctuation. He lifted his hand, palm open, the universal gesture for "I have nothing in my fist." Luke lifted his non-metal hand in answer. The air said nothing. The silence was weightless and immense. After Endor, the galaxy did not become simple. Empires do not fold themselves and lie down because a heart has been moved. They lunge and stagger and try for the throat one last time. Fleet engagements took on the frantic improvisatory music of creatures who suspect their cages have become fragile. Planetary governors found, to their confusion, that they were not gods after all. Stormtroopers woke without orders and moved with a grief that made some of them dangerous and some of them suddenly human in ways that broke them. The rebellion became the Republic again in fits and starts and mistakes and bricklaying. Leia slept sometimes. When she did, she dreamed of halls whose proportions were generous without arrogance and of weather recorded in the slope of a borrowed roof. She spoke more after Endor about Alderaan and less about loss. She would say to anyone who had ears for it, "One day I will take you to the Southern Falls," and then the sentence would soften into a fact. "I cannot." The canniness of grief is that it teaches one how to imagine the impossible with specificity. People listened and became larger. Luke began to build a new thing with a carpenter's attention to joints. He did it slowly, with a humility that made some impatient and others loyal. He went looking for students the way a good gardener goes looking for soil. Not asserting, but attentive. He found some and was refused by others. He blessed the refusals more than the acceptances because refusal is often the beginning of something honest. He went to Katuni and Petro and Gungi in a building on Chandrila where the stone had been cut by hands that expected to be thanked and not taxed. "You don't need me," he said, which was both true and courteous. "But I need what you know of living." Katuni smiled, head tipped, beads chiming. "It's not a curriculum," she warned him. "It's a way of being in rooms. That's hard to teach." "We will teach it by example," Luke said simply. "We will teach it by failure." "More likely," Petro muttered, not so low the others could not hear. He had a scar across his knuckles now from a time when he had chosen badly and survived. He held up his hand as if to make his own argument. "We will teach it by not being dead." Gungi set on the table between them something he had carved across years. A small, exacting model of a temple window through which light fell in a pattern, he remembered with his hands when dreams blurred the lines. Luke's breath caught. He looked at the wood. He looked at Gungi. "This," he said softly, "is how we begin." They built. They made mistakes without arrogance and corrected them slowly. They wrote nothing down that could be weaponized and nothing that could not be taught by touch and presence. They took in people who had been born into their gifts and people whose first languages were different kinds of listening. They taught them to breathe in sorrow and in luck. They taught them to stand where rooms need standing. They taught them how to close their eyes and not fear the dark, and how to open them after and see what the dark had kept safe. On Coruscant, still Coruscant, though for a while its name had been forced into a different suit. Traffic moved the way schools of fish move, and the weather sometimes pretended to happen. In an apartment with a long view of lights, a man and a woman who believed the future was tedious but better than the past argued over dinner about small intangibles and going to bed too late. In a small room not far away, a maintenance droid with a dent in its dome looked out through a grime-scummed window at a sky billboard that flickered between New Republic and a face with a jawline even ad companies could not deny and made a noise that might have been satisfaction if one liked to anthropomorphize machines. Vader was a history lesson now, and in lecture halls with thin windows he was used to make a point in opposing directions. Katuni sat once in the back of a room where a woman in a white coat spoke about breathing regulation in the presence of power. The woman said, "Monsters are convenient stories." And Katuni thought about doors opened and about what we owe to the parts of ourselves that refuse to be obedient to ruin. After class, she walked with the woman to a small stall where the tea was brewed with real leaves and not powder and bought them 2 cups. "Once," she said, "someone did something kind inside a life that did not make kindness simple." The woman nodded with the full attention of someone who respects other people's sentences and said, "Then tell that story out loud when it is safe for you to do so." Katuni smiled without showing her teeth and said, "I just did. Leia had a child." The news kept itself quiet under her skin for a time because she had work, and later because grief came back into the room in a different shape than before and demanded, absurdly, to be served. That is another story, and the galaxy is unkind to people whose parentage is more interesting to historians than to them. If you had asked Katuni, she would have said only this: inheritance is a kind of weather and a set of tools. Both require knowledge to survive. She would have added, "Name your child with a blessing, and if the blessing fails to hold, give them a key instead." Petro went home once, to the place that had nearly been his and then never was. He stood on a ridge above a village that had learned to fear the sound of engines and found, to his surprise, that he did not hate what he saw. People were carrying water. A girl ran along a wall with the audacity of the young and did not fall. He stood long enough for 3 suns to set, and then he left without speaking to anyone because sometimes mercy is not making a noise in front of people who don't know they're being watched. Gungi returned to Kashyyyk. It took him years to make the road he needed through bureaucracies and pirates and the New Republic's polite confusions. He stood at last in the shadow of iron roots that had been old before the Clone Wars were a rumor and lifted his hands to the bark and pressed his forehead against it and let the tree tell him what it had seen. He carved then, in a clearing where children's feet had drawn patterns in dust for generations, a figure as tall as his shoulder, a Wookiee elder with a staff and a particular tilt to the head that made those who saw it remember someone they had never met. Luke went to Tatooine and stood by a small house made of stubbornness and salt. The air smelled of char and of the old union between sand and sun. He thought of a boy who had looked across a beige horizon and wanted the sky, and of a man who had done everything wrong for reasons that were not jokes. He left the small wooden figure of a bird on a shelf in the garage where the oil made the air dense. He did not know who would find it. He hoped someone would. In time, in rooms with good air, Katuni told the story of the night in the council chamber to people who could bear it. She did not romanticize the moment because that would be untrue. She did not turn it into a balance sheet because that would be indecent. She said only, "A man who had already chosen many deaths chose, once, life for others. He may have chosen it because he could not do otherwise and still be himself. That is often why we do the right thing." She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not hers to distribute. She did not condemn him anew. That had been done, and besides, condemnation is often only a way of keeping one's hands clean in public. She laid the fact on the table like a plain bowl, and people put into it what they had to give. Gratitude, rage, bewilderment, relief. Leia listened once and did not flinch. After, when the room had emptied and the air's smell of many people's attention had dissipated, she said, "I am this complicated in every direction all the time. It is exhausting." Katuni laughed in sympathy. They sat shoulder to shoulder in companionable silence long enough for outside noise to reassemble around them. "Thank you," Leia added, "not for the story, which the world would have told without them eventually, but for telling it without making anyone small." T8 finally let its shell be polished. A young mechanic, new to the work and over-respectful, ran a cloth over the dome's dent and made it shine as if the old wound had become a jewel. The droid hummed in a cheerful register. Later, in storage, it rocked slightly on its coupler as if in laughter and let its logic drift backward in loops until it found in its memory banks a corridor under the temple where small feet had made barely any noise at all. It stored that audio separately so that if one day someone asked, it could replay the sound. Not as an artifact, but as an instrument. On a balcony on Coruscant where the evening wind moved like someone sorting their thoughts, Luke closed his eyes and let the city breathe through him. For a moment, perhaps because the air had tangled itself just so around the towers, or perhaps because certain species of ache never completely leave, he thought he felt another presence beside him. A warmth that was not heat, a weightless attention. He said into the air, because he was not afraid anymore of looking foolish, "I hope you know about the children." And then he smiled because of course he did. That was the entire point of telling the story out loud, where the Force could hear it and carry it to those who needed it. Qui-Gon's laughter brushed the back of his thoughts. No more than a ripple, like a fish turning deep in water. He did not try to hold it. He let it go with gratitude, because letting go had saved his father, and letting go was how one kept the door open for others. If you stand a while very still in the former council chamber, in the quiet hours when maintenance crews hum through their rounds and the thick glass shows a city pretending to sleep, you can hear, not with the ears which prefer drama, the smallest possible difference between empty and alive. It comes from the stone itself, which does not forget. A memory of small breaths counted carefully, of a seam opening and closing, of a blade that went out when every other blade that night stayed up. The temple remembers. The galaxy learned to remember alongside it. In that memory there is room not for absolution but for accuracy, which is a more rigorous kindness. People like to say later that mercy saved the world. That is a good sentence and perhaps even true. Better to say, a mercy made room for other mercies, the way one open door reveals another, until someone who had been running found, at last, a room in which to turn and stand. And in that standing the dark altered, slightly, enough for someone else to pass through to light. That is how such things work when they work at all.